How would you like to find a treasure map in your attic? That's the stimulus I'm talking about. Well, I did. Maybe you've seen a TV show called Warehouse 13 on Sci-Fi. It's a big government warehouse filled with spooky items. Sort of an X-Files meets moonlighting. Well, this is my life. I have a spooky warehouse filled with my collection of electronic junk. You have to get a picture of this warehouse firmly in your mind. It is my repository of electronic toys from the recording, broadcasting, and motion picture industry's last 100 years. It contains items from a century of media production, everything from early Edison dictaphones to wire recorders. I've got the shower stall from the TV show MASH, and original electronic transcriptions of the Dick Hames Autolite Battery radio show. I've got the AHB monitor mixer from the Rolling Stones' 1978 tour, and the original studio recording of the Outer Limits theme. I can't help it. I've been in the media business for almost half a century, and I collect stuff. And where is my favorite location for a field trip? You guessed it, it's back out into the spooky warehouse. It's very practical. Fuel expenses are nil. The chance of encountering a gendarme are slight, and I can grab a munchie as I wheel and make a turn at the Frigidaire. You, however, had better wear your boots because this might get a little deep. Maybe I had hit the speakers just a little too hard with the mix, and that explains why I didn't hear the box tumbling down at me as I slapped the fridge door closed. It was a solid hit to the hand holding the cottage cheese and cherry preserves mix, and it went down in a blur. The box followed its path, and the packing tape popped loose as it came to rest at my feet. The label read 2008 Memorabilia, but sometimes labels lie. I started leafing through the contents, and after a sheet of Deep Space Nine stationery and a paper airplane made by my son with "Oh Dad, I Love My Dad" scribbled as only a 5-year-old could along the fuselage, I encountered a brass men's room sign and a plastic 1-quart freezer bag, which contained, oddly enough, a small brown grocery store bag. Flashback 35 years, and I was positive I had found my point of focus for this article, and then I heard Whipping Post come to bat in my playlist, and I was sure I had the right item. This brown paper bag had belonged to an old friend of mine by the name of Doug Cashman. Doug and I played in bands together decades ago and had gone on to experience a lot of the music world of the 70s together. The bag had a simple set of intersecting lines drawn in pencil on it. They were neatly labeled and were, in fact, a map to the Allman Brothers farm in Macon, Georgia. The air is thin in Taos, New Mexico. The town sits at almost 7,000 feet above mean sea level. This area holds an almost mythical place in the history of the Southwest. Mountain men and bandits occupied its streets. Kit Carson lived close by, and the Sangre de Cristo Mountains soar over 2 miles into the sky. Dennis Hopper lived and was buried there. Taos is where my friend Doug Cashman now makes his home. Doug had grown up in Chicago. At the start of the 20th century, his grandfather had been an instrument salesman with the company that eventually became K Guitars. He sold and played his way through the steel and coal towns from the east to the Midwest. Doug taught himself to play the drums when he was 21 and in the Navy. In 1962, Doug went to the Black Hawk Club on Hyde Street in San Francisco and saw the Ahmad Jamal Trio with Vernal Fournier drumming. He was impressed and brought some of the band's records back on the ship where he wore out the grooves, listening and learning. Back home from the sea in 1963, Doug was learning to play the drums and going to garage and woods parties around Chicago Heights, and there he saw a band called the Vibratones with a hot young guitar player named Barry Oakley. Barry was still in high school at the time, but he quit and went on the road when he was offered the bassist spot in Tommy Roe's backup band, the Romans. Eventually, Barry wound up in Jacksonville, Florida, where he played in a group called The Second Coming, which also had a guitarist by the name of Dickie Betts. Meanwhile, the two brothers from the South were on the other side of the continent, and they were not having a good time. Dwayne and Greg were living in a house in La La Land with the Nitty Gritty Dirt Band. They called their band Hourglass, and their label, Liberty Records, had them dress up in psychedelic outfits, playing covers of pop songs. Live, Hourglass was pretty good. Steve Stills and Neil Young wrote the liner notes on one of their albums. But the albums, well, they were just plain embarrassing because Liberty dictated what they could play and how to play it. Dwayne, disgusted, headed back to Florida. Greg was forced to stay in L.A. because he owed Liberty Records one more album. In November of 1968, Dwayne had been doing session work and was living in Barry Oakley's house. Naturally, he was jamming some with Second Coming. A gent named Phil Walden, who had been Otis Redding's manager, put together his own record label called Capricorn, and he knew that he wanted Dwayne to be on it. Dwayne called brother Greg and said, "Get back out here," and the Allman Brothers Band was born. Now, I know this is a lot of history, but stick with me. If there's a quiz, it will be open book and graded on the curve. Back in Chicago, Doug Cashman joined two of Barry's old bandmates and honed his chops there until he moved to Southern California in 1971 to go to school. He lived in a side of a freeway town called Walnut, and that's when I met him and was fortunate enough to play in a couple of bands with him. Doug was developing quite a reputation as a musician's musician. He wrote really interesting songs that were never the same old 1-4-5. Doug transferred his schooling to San Francisco State, and he moved out to the Great Highway, where he decided to finance the production of his own album. He spent a lot of time hitchhiking between L.A. and the Bay with an old suitcase. In 1975, Doug was working as a street artist and selling some crafts to get cash, and he ran into a hot guitarist whom he'd known back east named Jim Vincent, who later replaced Robin Ford in Tom Scott's L.A. Express. Jim wanted to play on Doug's record, and I was asked to be the recording engineer and mixer for most of the sessions. Doug spared no expense, and he took us into some of the finest and most fabled recording studios on the West Coast. We recorded at Wally Hyder's in both Hollywood and San Francisco, and at The Church in San Anselmo, as well as my own far-out recording studios in the heart of the Redwoods. In 1971, the Allman Brothers were playing at the Whiskey A Go-Go for the first time since they had failed there as Hourglass. The first Allman Brothers Band album had just made the Billboard charts, and Doug had gone to see them. He and Barry started reminiscing about playing music in Chicago, and Barry invited him down to the brothers' farm in Macon to jam and party and pick up some shrooms. One of the band's roadies carefully drew a map on a paper bag, and you knew this was coming, I bet. That's the paper bag which I found in my warehouse. No GPS or MapQuest back then. Doug had some plans for going to the farm, and while there, getting the brothers' producer and industry legend Tom Dowd to listen to his tapes. You have no idea how excited that made me. Tom Dowd championed multi-tracking and invented the modern mixing console. He recorded rhythm and blues and jazz greats Ray Charles, Aretha Franklin, Herbie Mann, Charles Mingus, Otis Redding, Bobby Darin, John Coltrane, Charlie Parker, Thelonious Monk, and many others. In the rock world, he had produced Eric Clapton, Lynyrd Skynyrd, Rod Stewart, Chicago, Cream, the Jay Giles Band, Meatloaf, Willie Nelson, the James Gang, and of course the Allman Brothers. This is the guy who brought Duane Allman into play with Eric Clapton on Layla, and now he was going to hear a mix that I had done. Wow, I could hardly believe it. Well, it took Doug almost 4 years to get down there. He didn't have a label footing his expenses. He did everything out of his back pocket with what he could save from his GI Bill and selling crafts. During that time, both Duane Allman and bassist Barry Oakley had died in motorcycle accidents. The farm was deserted. Doug stayed with Tony Humphreys in Macon. Tony was a mixer for the Marshall Tucker Band and was working with Dowd at Capricorn Studios on the Win, Lose, or Draw album. He took Doug's tapes into the studio, and after listening, Dowd said, "Keep doing what you're doing." 5 words that vindicated all the effort we had put into the production at the time. Doug made the most of his time down south. He was the quintessential couch surfer, spending a week at Tony Humphreys, and then he stayed with Michael Callahan, who introduced him to a lot of important people. Michael had been the roadie who mixed the Allman's live sound, and he went all the way back to when Barry had been in the Romans. Doug also spent some time at Cotton Studios with George Conger, Barry Branhorst, and Michael Pierce. Now, Doug is nothing if not innovative. Cotton had some artwork that had been turned down by the Capricorn band Cowboy, and Doug talked them into letting him use it for the cover of his album, and he convinced Jamie Chase to do the rear cover. Doug returned to California, and we had the album mastered and 500 copies pressed. By now, Jim Vincent had been signed to Caribou Records, and so Doug changed the band's name from the Cashman Vincent Band to the Cashman Vaquero Band, or CVB as we called it. Vaquero means cowboy, and Doug had worked on a ranch and had done some bareback bronc riding. He had also named the record in memory of Barry Oakley. Ron Sadis, who had played with Barry in the Vibratones, had written a song by that name, and Doug added the lyrics, and it became the album's title cut. Sadly, Ron died before the album's release. When the pressing arrived, I took 50 of the albums, and Doug sent 50 to his mom. Doug went to Hawaii for a while and sublet his tower hotel room in San Francisco to a friend. His friend didn't pay the rent, and the landlord hired 2 thugs, real thugs on parole, to get him out. They rushed in and started throwing all of the contents of the apartment into a dumpster. Out went Doug's master tapes, his historical photographs, and 250 copies of the album. They were gone. Oddly enough, and proving that karma does exist, the thugs started dealing drugs from the place, and on December 8, 1980, the day John Lennon was shot, the thugs got into a gun battle with the San Francisco Police Department. One was killed, the other shot 5 times and sentenced to life in San Quentin. Don't mess with the music. The album never went anywhere, and I heard that Doug had died. 18 years later, I was contacted by some music collectors in Sweden. They had tracked me down from the album's credits, and they wanted to know if I had any copies of the record, because it was a classic example of San Francisco rock from that period. I sold them 4 copies for $50 each, and then about 3 years later, a very alive Doug Cashman contacted me. After the shock had worn off, we caught up, and I found out that the album lists for 150 to 250 euros in the record catalog. One sold on eBay for $500. Doug never made the big time in the music industry, but that record of his sure has legs, Yesterday I checked Yahoo auctions in Japan because I heard there was a copy for sale. I saw a Janus album for 300 yen and one by the Allman Brothers for 500 yen. The CVB album had a bid of 17,500 yen, and it still had 6 hours to go. I thought I could hear Doug laughing all the way from Taos.